Good morning, everyone. This is Maria from PCDV, and you are listening to the Survivor-Driven Trauma-Informed Services and Rapid Rehousing webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm excited to be able to present this information to you, and I hope that it is beneficial. To make sure that it is beneficial, I would love for you all to participate as much as possible. There are many experts that are listening in to this webinar, and I, as you all know, would much rather have a conversation than just me talking to you for this whole time. So I'm going to be happy to take questions as we go. So as you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A box, and we'll answer them as we move forward. Also, if you have questions that are more clarification, or particularly when we get into the procedural part of rapid rehousing, if there are things that don't make sense or information that you have that's different than the information that I have, please speak up and let me know. I feel like this is sort of a moving process for all of us, and I want to make sure we're all on the same page and able to move through this together. So if you have questions or information that I don't have, or information that's different than what you're hearing today, particularly the procedural part, please step in and put a note in the Q&A box, and we can talk about it as we go. This webinar is really going to focus on the basics of rapid rehousing. So there's going to be information that some of you already have, but the good thing about this webinar is that it exists now all in one place, which means as you have new coworkers come onto your team, you can share that information with them via this webinar. So as I said, if you have questions as we go, please do enter them into the Q&A box. So by the end of this webinar today, hopefully, you're going to have a better understanding of survivor-driven trauma-informed services, which is the framework of domestic violence housing first work, which is what we use to provide all housing services and specifically rapid rehousing. We're going to talk about the organizational impact and the individual impact of survivor-driven trauma-informed services. Then we're going to talk about rapid rehousing, the regional work that's going on, the DV Housing First demonstration project, and our partnership with the National Alliance for Safe Housing. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of rapid rehousing, and if you are running a rapid rehousing program, what is going to be expected of you. And then we'll take some time at the end to ask general housing questions, and hopefully gives you some answers to questions that have been ongoing, and record any questions that we need to follow up on, and we'll absolutely do that as we go. So what is domestic violence housing first? Let's start by looking at what housing first is. So housing first was developed by housing providers in major urban areas in the United States. There is question about whether it started in New York City or Philadelphia or San Francisco, and none of that really matters. What matters is what came of it. There was a need to look at alternatives to the traditional model of housing. The phrase in the housing community used to be called housing readiness, which meant that a person would become homeless, and then they would have to get ready to be housed. They would have to spend time in emergency shelter or in transitional housing before they would be ready to rent in the market. And there needed to be a shift away from that. And it was driven by the concept that once housing is secured by an individual or family, that they're actually able to address the things that are more pressing for them, which is a really sensible concept. And the application to DV is, I think, pretty linear. When the domestic violence housing first movement started, it was really based on the idea that there's never enough shelter space. And we know that in the more urban and suburban areas of Pennsylvania, that shelters are constantly full, and there's a need for other solutions. Also, a handful of years ago, HUD deprioritized transitional housing, which was significant for the domestic violence community, as it was something that we really relied on as a bridge between emergency shelter and permanent housing, survivors renting in the market. And what HUD found is that transitional housing was really just keeping people homeless longer. The longer a family or an individual is homeless, the more likely they are to become homeless again. And so transitional housing was sort of acting as a holding space. Rather than helping survivors move quickly on to permanent housing, it was retaining them within homelessness. So HUD deprioritized transitional housing in favor of more common models now, like rapid rehousing, for example, and prevention diversion work, which we'll be talking about next month in depth. Also, there has been significant reoccurrence of family and individual homelessness, and this is something that's tricky for DV providers to talk about, because we know that once a family comes into emergency shelter, they are in fact considered homeless, and we'll talk a little bit more about the homeless definition for DV survivors later in the presentation. Although we want to prioritize family safety and survivor safety, we want to make sure that we're not unnecessarily encouraging survivors to become homeless unless they absolutely have to, because once again, they become homeless, they're far more likely to become homeless down the road. So if we can interrupt the cycle of homelessness for a survivor, they're far more likely to become stable long term. So domestic violence housing first started about 10 years ago, really centered in the West Coast. There's a program called Volunteers of America Home Safe in Portland, Oregon, that really pioneered rapid rehousing for DV survivors. It is absolutely true that rapid rehousing was happening in other places across the US, but as we know in promising program models, if there is money for research attached, it's far more likely that individuals know about those programs, and VOA did have money for research attached to their project. When VOA started adopting the DV Housing First model, the primary reason for that is that the city of Portland and the county where Portland is, Multnomah County, decided to close all of its emergency shelters. They decided that the homeless problem was escalating in Portland, and that the response to that would be to close emergency shelters and focus exclusively on permanent housing. And while that, or in theory, could make sense, in practice, it absolutely did not make sense. And particularly for domestic violence survivors, what's needed is a range of responses so a survivor can choose what's going to work best for them. There is a concept in the Housing First work that means that we're going to close shelters and only focus on permanent housing, because that's how that played out in Portland and some other communities. But what we know is that best practice regarding Housing First work is providing a range of options. So because Portland didn't have that range of options anymore, the domestic violence programs began to look at what they could do. They pioneered rapid rehousing. They looked at prevention and diversion work through the use of flexible funds. And this became a core component of DV Housing First, knowing that services could exist and that survivors could get into permanent housing. And then there was flexible funding available that was far more flexible than what our typical government contracts would allow, to support survivors in retaining permanent housing, which is oftentimes the thing that was really keeping survivors from staying stable. So the Gates Foundation looked at the work that was happening at Volunteers of America in Portland and wanted to replicate that work in Washington. So the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence started a pilot project in partnership with the Gates Foundation, and they developed in about 2014 the first DV Housing First cohort. And that cohort included urban and rural communities around the King County area where Seattle is located, where it's the second highest rental market in the country, and affordable housing was almost non-existent. And what they found is, with very flexible funding, and this funding came directly from the Gates Foundation, survivors were able to obtain and retain permanent housing in a way they hadn't been able to prior. The retention of the housing is what became very important too through the study that was done of the program, and that retention rates were in the mid 90%, which is almost unheard of when a family goes from domestic violence crisis into permanent housing. So it really showed the efficacy of flexible funds supporting families in ways that they are identifying they need support. The other piece that really came through in this program was the importance of flexible services paired with flexible funds. what we heard from survivors in Washington State over and over again is that the funding was so important, and it was the thing that kept them in their home. But the thing that really changed their lives and really turned things around from them was the flexible services that were offered alongside the funds. So that now in research is developing as a best practice in housing first work. The District Alliance for Safe Housing in Washington, D.C. then took what Washington State was doing and adapted it for their community. D.C. also has one of the highest rates of homelessness and one of the most expensive rental markets in the community. And they developed what they called the Survivor Resilience Fund. And this is one of the more forward-thinking, I think, models of DV Housing First work. They have a fund in which survivors can apply. There's a very brief application that a survivor writes to Dash and says, this is what I need the funding for. And the survivor is written a check directly. This really highlights the idea of survivor expertise and shows a really great and innovative model. It is not the model that works most places in the country because most of our funders wouldn't allow for checks to be written directly to survivors, but it does show a very innovative model that has made a huge difference nationally. So Lori asked how flex services are defined, and what I mean by that is advocacy and services that we would give to survivors in DV programs currently, but having survivors define how and when those services occur. Mobile advocacy is a huge piece of this. A survivor is not expected to come to a domestic violence program for services, but that the DV counselor and the survivor can work together to decide where meeting is best for them. I've had a lot of coworkers meet with survivors in their car, meet with survivors at McDonald's while the kids are playing, meet with survivors at a kid's soccer game because that's the easiest place for them to get together. So really highly tailored, individualized services that aren't required. So in congruence with what all of our funding sources say is that we're not to mandate services for any survivor, but that services are flexible and highly tailored to their needs. So that's what we mean by flexible services. So there are three core components of domestic violence housing first. The first is survivor-driven trauma-informed services. The second is community partnerships. And the third is flexible funding. We're going to talk a lot about survivor-driven trauma-informed services and flexible funding today. The thing that I would really love for us in Pennsylvania to view rapid rehousing as is flexible funding. I think that there is an idea because of the work that foundations like the Gates Foundation did, is that flexible funds are only from foundations and they can be used for absolutely anything. And what we know is that is a rare case when an organization or a coalition can get that kind of funding. So what we've been doing is working with our federal partners to make sure that rapid rehousing can be as tailored to survivor needs as possible. That's how the DV bonus in the HUD application came to in the past few years. And so I think that in Pennsylvania, it would really benefit us to view rapid rehousing as a form of flexible funds, because flexible funding is anything that helps survivors obtain and maintain and retain permanent housing. The other great thing that we have here in Pennsylvania is relocation funds, which are a form of flexible funding. And again, they're not as flexible, and I've spoken to probably nearly all of you who are on this webinar about relocation funds, and there's clearly a need for those funds to be more flexible, and PCADV will be advocating for increased flexibility with relocation funds because we know that the needs of survivors have changed. But it is incredible to have a flexible funding source built into your state funding. That is rare, and it is really impactful for the work that you all are able to do with survivors. So as we're moving through and thinking about flexible funds, I would encourage you to think about rapid rehousing as a flexible funding source. I would encourage you to think about relocation funds as a flexible funding source. And then through conversations with many of you, I also have learned that you are using, private fundraising as flexible funds to support survivors. And so if you think about your private fundraising too, that you do organizationally to support survivors in permanent housing, as we're thinking about flexible funds. So the third component in community relationships really focuses on access to permanent housing. So relationships with landlords, relationships with housing authorities, that sort of thing. We won't be focusing so much on that today. And in fact, there will be down the line another training on landlord engagement specifically. But when you're looking at the third component of DV housing first, that's what that means. So digging into survivor-driven trauma-informed services, the expert that I look to in the field to really support this work is Jill Davies. And if any of you have spent any time with me at all, you have heard me talk about Jill Davies because she is certainly a hero of mine. She is an attorney in Connecticut and wrote a book called Domestic Violence Advocacy. There's been an update to that book in the past few years. And Jill was one of the first folks to really look into the term survivor-driven, or as she talks about it, victim-defined advocacy. I use the terms survivor and victim interchangeably, and I would encourage you to use whatever term you're most comfortable with. Jill states in her work specifically, she uses the word victim because she's an attorney, and that is in the legal system the most common language used. So in Domestic Violence Advocacy, in her book, Jill talks about offering survivors options, resources, and strategies that are relevant to each victim's priorities, decisions, and risks. And that those options are offered in a way that doesn't undermine the survivor's ability to then implement what she has chosen to do the work and take her life on it in the way that she identifies as best. Jill also uses female pronouns in her work because, as we all know, the overwhelming number of survivors are female identified. There is a lot of work being done to move the work toward gender neutral pronouns, but in reflective of her work, I've used female pronouns here. So what Jill highlights is when the answer to the questions on the last bullet point are driving the focus, then you know that the advocacy and support work that you're doing is victim defined. So looking at what the survivor is most concerned about right now, what does the survivor want right now, and what can wait? So concerns, desires, and then what needs to be prioritized. That's your work as an advocate in helping a survivor navigate systems. So the other piece of this then is trauma-informed services. And that is organizations and practices that incorporate an understanding of the pervasiveness and impact of trauma, and designed to reduce re-traumatization, support healing and resiliency, and address the root causes of abuse and violence. There will be a lot of work done by PCADV in the upcoming months to talk about trauma-informed services, and this definition is based on that upcoming work. So Jill outlines the idea of safety versus safer in her book too, which when you're working with survivors to obtain permanent housing is something that's critical to keep in mind. What we have in the movement identified as important is safety. And when we boil safety down, what we mean is a survivor is experiencing no violence, that all of their basic human needs are met, and that they've achieved social and emotional well-being. And what Jill points out is the absolute unobtainable nature of this goal. One of the things that I like to point out to people is that even though, all of us that are listening are working and hopefully safe in our lives, but not experiencing violence, people's social and emotional well-being is all over the map. And that's something that we work on constantly to be met. Basic human needs too is something that is different for every individual. And so even in a group of people that aren't experiencing violence, having all of that occur at the same time is almost impossible. So we've been working toward this unattainable goal for survivors, and it has really impacted how we structure our work. And so what she encourages is looking at a survivor being safer instead of focusing on safety. And that means less violence, their economic stability is increased, and their well-being is strengthened, which is the core of the work that you all do every day. And it's important when you're thinking about survivor-driven services that you're really allowing survivors to say, this is what I need, this is what's going to work for me, and this is how I want to get there, and these are the resources that I need. It's that sort of framework for services that allows a survivor to actually become safer, rather than an advocate being viewed as the expert on an individual's safety. So the other piece of this is trauma-informed services, and organizations cannot provide trauma-informed services unless they have a trauma-informed organizational culture. These are 4 core components of a trauma-informed organizational culture, and it is essential that the culture is within the fabric of the organization, that it doesn't live, that trauma-informed services or trauma-informed culture within an organization doesn't live with one person or one executive director or one program manager, that it exists from everyone through the board to the volunteers to the staff, and have a community understanding of what your specific organization's trauma-informed culture looks like. But these 4 core components are essential to allowing survivors to really feel that your work and your organization is trauma-informed. I think that one of the traps that I've seen organizations often fall into is that you do all of this work that is built on trauma-informed services and people in the field who have identified what that's supposed to look like, and you implement all of these things, but then there's no evaluation, change, reevaluation, and more change that occurs. So this is never a goal that is reached. It is a process that's engaged in. And I think that as organizations adapt that and adopt that into their framework, more likely they are to succeed. So we know that trauma can stem from a lot of places, and it's particularly important to highlight that given the work that we all do and the constant trauma that we swim in culturally, between the 24-hour news cycle and the constant murders of Black and trans people that are prominent in the news, the abundance of natural disasters and war that are occurring that we're all privy to. It's important to know that trauma is working through everyone in different ways and can show up for people in lots of different ways. So the book that I was talking about prior to this is Domestic Violence Advocacy, and the author is Jill Davies. And so she really dug into the idea of victim-defined trauma-informed services, which became a core component of DV Housing First. So another great book when you're looking at domestic violence advocacy and how trauma, our own trauma plays a part in that, is a book called Trauma Stewardship. It's written by a former domestic violence advocate who worked for the LGBTQ DV organization in the Pacific Northwest, who is a national partner to the Battered Women's Justice Project and a few other places. She talks about when she worked there, she took a vacation. Her family is from Puerto Rico, and she took a vacation and she was so excited to leave. And she got there and she was going on a hike with her partner and their family, and they got to this amazing vista on this cliff that overlooked a valley, and it was truly beautiful. And she said that all she could think of was how could an emergency helicopter land safely if someone fell off of the cliff. And that's a pretty dramatic example of how trauma impacts us. But I know as a domestic violence advocate myself that I can think back in times of my life when I felt that way. And so it's important that as we're moving through this work, we're really looking at how trauma is impacting us, realizing those moments when we should be experiencing joy and we're not because of how trauma has impacted us, and having an organizational culture and plan to help folks that work in our organizations move through trauma as they're experiencing it. So this is the other core component of trauma-informed services. So Domestic Violence Housing First is survivor-driven trauma-informed services community engagement, and flexible funds. And like I said, we're going to be focusing on survivor-driven trauma-informed services today and flexible funding. So the framework that we use to provide rapid rehousing is the framework of domestic violence housing first work. Rapid rehousing should be viewed as a trauma-informed response to survivors' need for safety and stability. Rapid rehousing is, although very popular in the housing community, is not just HUD's latest solution to the housing crisis. What it actually is the ability to have a highly flexible, highly tailored program for survivors of domestic violence to move into permanent housing and to retain that permanent housing on a long-term basis. What I'm hoping to do today is help clear up some of the myths around rapid rehousing. So as a domestic violence community, we're all moving into rapid rehousing with the same information, because I, as a former provider, absolutely understand everyone's concern around rapid rehousing. I ran a rapid rehousing program. I know how it can feel to engage in rapid rehousing in communities. And so I want to spend some time sort of dispelling those myths today and getting all of us on the same page. We can make sure that we are providing rapid rehousing in the manner in which we know is best for survivors. So rapid rehousing is community-based permanent housing when you boil it all down. Households in rapid rehousing programs are designed to live as independently as possible. It's a real move away from the idea of, communal shelter, certainly, but even semi-communal transitional housing, which is what many of us have run for many years. So HUD guidance says that rapid rehousing can be up to 24 months of assistance, and that assistance includes housing identification, rent and move-in assistance, and services to support retention. We're going to break down each of those sort of components of rapid rehousing and talk about how they apply to survivors. But the thing that I want to highlight to you here is that services and assistance can exist for up to 24 months. Now, in your COC, and there are many COCs represented on this call, but each COC has what's called rapid rehousing standards. And those are developed by the COC, and they are theoretically done with community and provider input. We all know it's not always that simple, but that is how they are designed. In that, you are going to find that most of your standards say within your COC that rapid rehousing should be up to 12 months maximum. The idea within the continuum of care is that you provide as little financial assistance to each household so you can serve more households, which is, it makes sense. But what we know with survivors is that there are going to be times that they need more financial assistance than other individuals and families that are experiencing homelessness. Oftentimes a survivor will move in and get settled and be toward the very end of what we would consider a typical rapid rehousing program. So maybe in month 9 or 10 of assistance, and all of a sudden their abusive partner throws down a custody battle that they were not expecting, and their whole life, turns into focusing on that. They're not able to work in the way that they were, and all the stability that they've built for themselves can very quickly erode. We know that that's common practice in domestic violence and how abusive partners work. That sort of interruption of stability is such a common tactic of abuse. And it is not something that folks in mainstream homeless services understand. It is something that we all, and I know because I've sat in many meetings and in many community conversations with you all, inform the mainstream homelessness system of on a consistent basis. But what I can promise you is this is going to be a message that we have to provide over and over and over again. So as we're looking at standards that the COC is set for rapid rehousing, most of them, like I say, are going to tell you 12 months. But what is important is that you are reevaluating a survivor's need based on the information that survivor is giving you on a monthly basis. So if a survivor needs all of their rent paid 1 month, even if that is 9 months into the program, that's what you should do. And there are budgeting tools and forecast tools that us at PCADB can help you with. And as you're thinking about spending rapid rehousing, for those programs that are PCADB funded through Rapid Rehousing, my coworker Dana will be providing you with a forecasting tool so you can be sure that you are spending appropriately and are accounting for those months when you had a household that you thought was going to move through assistance relatively quickly, and then all of a sudden they don't. We want rapid rehousing to be as responsive and flexible and trauma-informed as possible. That is the best way to provide rapid rehousing. And if you are experiencing any sort of pushback from your COC regarding how the trauma-informed manner in which you're providing rapid rehousing, please reach out to me. I'm more than happy to speak to anyone at your COC to make sure that they understand how survivors are best served with rapid rehousing. Okay, that's enough of that soapbox. But the application to domestic violence is clear. We don't have access to transitional housing in the way that we used to. We don't want survivors to have to become homeless if they don't actually need emergency shelter. And one of the things that we've seen with rapid rehousing is that if it's provided in a trauma-informed manner in communities, it actually then allows your emergency shelters to have space for the people and the families that need it the most. So the people that are really experiencing high levels of danger and are really needing to move out of their home quickly, it allows for emergency shelter to be primarily for those families while giving the option for rapid families that aren't experiencing such a high level of danger. So as I was saying, there are three core components of rapid rehousing. Housing identification is the first. And Chris Bilhart, who many of you know, who works for the National Alliance for Safe Housing, who will be visiting some of us in the next couple of weeks and has helped design our program here in Pennsylvania. She wrote an incredible article for the National Alliance for Safe Housing, taking the three core components of rapid and breaking them down into individual application for survivors. So the National Alliance to End Homelessness is a national organization that works in advocacy for funding for homelessness and best practices for providing homelessness assistance. The National Alliance to End Homelessness was the organization that really developed these three core components, and they have worked very closely with the National Alliance for Safe Housing to make sure that the products that they're producing, the best practices that they're recommending, are survivor-driven and trauma-informed and are at least including survivors in their work. We have a lot of friends at the National Alliance, which is fantastic. And so Chris was able to take these three core components that they identified and really modify them for survivors to have the most benefit from rapid rehousing. So component one is housing identification, and what this means is that you as a provider are going to help a participant identify, obtain, and financially secure permanent housing. So to take that, there are some ideas about what can help survivors do that. Sharing information about domestic violence with landlords is one. Offering to coach a survivor to have that conversation with the landlord is another. Validating safety concerns, which we know are often minimized by mainstream housing providers around location of housing. Constantly safety planning with survivors to make sure that they are making the best choices for themselves in what their housing options are. Making sure that we're working with landlords that have multiple properties, so we don't have 10 survivors living on the same property, because that landlord is willing to work with survivors. And then offering flexible financial assistance and rental subsidy, negotiating costs with landlords, even if that means paying a double deposit so a survivor can move into a property. And then also connecting the survivor with financial counseling, which is something that happens all of the time in your programs here in Pennsylvania through the Economic Justice Project that many of you are involved in. So there's a best practice reminder, committing to DV Housing First Principles, keeping safety in mind, and practice survivor-driven advocacy. Core component two is rent and move-in assistance. So what this means is providing financial assistance based on need for rental and move-in. We know that stress and mental health concerns can be slow to resolve as the survivor is moving out of crisis and into more stability, but this is also the time that lethality risk could increase because, as we said prior, this is when abusive partners can look at someone's increased stability and want to do everything they can to make sure that that doesn't continue. So what we can do to help survivors is be flexible with subsidies and look at how they can really increase their income. Connecting survivors to health resources and opportunities to rebuild community is essential. One of the things that we see a lot with survivors moving into rapid rehousing is they have identified that what is going to be safest for them long term is to move back into a community where their abusive partner may have lived, or connections to their abusive partner still may be in that community. And what they've identified is that they too have connections in that community, whether it's their family or their faith community or social services that are supportive to them. And that is more important to them than proximity to their abusive partner or abusive partner's family, because we know that community is what keeps people safe and motivated to continue. And so that's an important piece of this. It's also important to continually safety plan and make sure that that is the best option for survivors, make sure that they understand they have other choices, but if that is what they're choosing, to support that choice. And then, as we were saying prior, practice mobile advocacy, supporting survivors, literally and figuratively where they are, helping them navigate complex systems, and also then navigating their ongoing relationship with their abusive partner. We, know very few survivors that are able to just leave and completely, disconnect from abusive partners because there are ongoing obligations with children or shared finances or other things and we want to make sure that survivors have support in that. So practicing individualized, tailored services is really important, and we're going to get more into that now. Are services that support retention of housing for survivors. This is providing individualized advocacy and counseling to assist participants in keeping safe and stable housing. So one of the things that many of your rapid rehousing standards within the continuum of care are going to talk about is a model of service called progressive engagement. And for those of you that attended the East DV coordinated entry meeting a couple weeks ago, we talked a little bit about progressive engagement. I wanted to make sure to mention that here. So progressive engagement is a service practice that has gone alongside rapid rehousing sort of since rapid rehousing came into being. And the idea is that you're going to, as a provider, offer the least amount of services possible, knowing that over time, services can increase if the participant is saying that they need them. This is not at all how we practice DV advocacy. So this is another place where what the mainstream practice for rapid rehousing is doesn't really apply to survivors, nor is it congruent with what we know survivors need. So as I was saying, through the Washington State Coalition Project, what we saw over and over again is that the financial support was fantastic, but what really mattered was offering a service-enriched program to survivors. And so we want to practice highly tailored mobile advocacy that allows survivors to really have their needs met based on what they are identifying their needs are. The more services offered, the more likely that survivor is to retain their housing. So I would never advise anyone to shy away from services, even if your community is one that promotes progressive engagement. If you need some talking points around progressive engagement and how that does not work for survivors, again, please feel free to reach out to me and I can help you have that conversation with the leaders of your continuum of care. So now we're going to get into what it actually means to provide rapid rehousing. Because of the domestic violence bonus that HUD has offered for the last 2 years, and we were hopeful it will offer again in the upcoming NOFA, we are experiencing more ability to provide permanent housing support to survivors than we ever have before as a community. Pennsylvania has received a significant amount of funding. With this last award, it is nearly $3 million in rapid rehousing funds in the rural communities alone. So that doesn't include the urban or suburban communities that have been practicing rapid rehousing. longer in some situations. So we are well funded here in Pennsylvania. We know it's never going to be enough, but it is a huge difference than what we were looking at prior. So we're going to talk about rapid rehousing eligibility and procedure. We're going to talk about Category 4 homeless in brief. I'm going to give you some information on that, and then you can contact me for more information. There's also a webinar I can refer you to that was done prior. We're going to talk about the coordinated entry process, even though that's different in every COC. I'll give you a high-level example. We're going to talk about being document ready for survivors that are entering rapid. We're going to talk about inspections, and I'm actually going to lean on some of you that are listening into this webinar to help me talk about inspections, because they are different and I've gotten conflicting information. And so any clarity that you all who are currently running rapid rehousing programs can give to this, I would appreciate it. We're going to talk about leasing and then rental assistance and supportive services. So the homeless definition under the HEARTH Act for Category 4 homeless is fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence. A few months ago, Lee Howard and I did a webinar for the East and West COCs, and the webinar can be found on the Pennsylvania COC website that talks extensively about Category 4. We've done some in-person trainings about Category 4. And if you need more information, please reach out to me. I'm happy to provide any support that you need to make sure that your continuum has a good understanding of Category 4. One of the things that's important is looking at the definition of fleeing. And I would like to thank specifically the domestic violence providers in the Western COC who helped me develop a document that really is helping mainstream housing providers and folks running coordinated entry understand Category 4 better. So these are some of the questions that the folks in the West COC came up with, that if a provider is needing to understand if someone is fleeing, because the concept looks different for every survivor, these are some good questions to ask. It's important also to remember that a survivor is considered homeless if they are fleeing or attempting to flee DV, even if they are staying with friends and family. This is something that is misunderstood really nationally about the idea of fleeing, and something that many of us are working to actively correct in the field. Category 4 homelessness allows a survivor to be eligible for all of the same resources that someone who is literally homeless, so a person sleeping in a shelter, in a car, outside, or other place not meant for human habitation, would also be eligible for. When I'm talking about eligibility here, I'm talking about specifically COC HUD-funded rapid rehousing. If you're a community that also uses emergency services grant for ESG for rapid rehousing, the eligibility for survivors there is both Category 1, so that is literal homelessness, and Category 4, fleeing domestic violence. So the easiest way to think about that, ESG rapid, a survivor has to be in shelter or sleeping outside or sleeping in a car and fleeing domestic violence to be eligible. With COC rapid, they do not. They could be living in their home and move directly from their home into a unit supported by rapid rehousing, because they would be eligible for that unit. Dangerous or life-threatening is another thing that oftentimes mainstream providers feel as though they need to help a survivor define. We know that that is not true. And so my colleagues in the West COC also helped develop the idea of what dangerous or life-threatening means. Then I also wanted to make sure that we're talking about eligibility for survivors. We're also talking about basic housing protections. And I know there's been some questions about VAWA, and I will be getting out more information about VAWA specifically in the upcoming months. But the HUD rule on VAWA 2013, which means that HUD has adopted VAWA, is outlined here. And so the status of a survivor cannot be used to evict from nor deny access to housing, and applicants cannot be denied housing based on factors that are a direct result of domestic violence, such as poor credit or rental history. These are key things as you are moving through rapid rehousing with a survivor to remember. and can be used to advocate specifically with landlords for survivors. As you need support around that, please let me know and we can talk through that and the best way to make sure that landlords understand VAWA and that you understand VAWA and that it's working to support survivors getting into housing they may not otherwise. Category 4 is what makes a survivor eligible for rapid rehousing. Coordinated entry is what gets a survivor access to rapid rehousing. So for rapid rehousing funded with HUD COC funds, all entries into all programs must come from the coordinated entry community queue. That looks different in each of your continuums of care. Coordinated entry in Pennsylvania started in various COCs up to 4 years ago. It was mandated by HUD and is now the process through which all HUD funds flow in a community. So the idea was that a survivor should not, or someone experiencing homelessness should not have to call 12 programs to be able to maybe get an interview at one to then be denied, that there should be some sort of equitable system that exists in the community that allows a household to be evaluated and then be referred directly into services. The thought is that it would streamline services or streamline entry into services and make that entry more equitable for each household. We know that it has not been that easy and that there are real mixed reviews about coordinated entry, which is why we as a domestic violence community are spending so much time talking about coordinated entry and meeting about coordinated entry. And if you are in a COC where you are concerned about your coordinated entry system and you haven't talked to me about it yet, please let me know. There are lots of options for survivors interacting with coordinated entry systems, and we want to make sure that your coordinated entry system is as accessible to survivors as possible. DV coordinated entry systems exist in other places in the country too. Here in Pennsylvania, the majority of the systems are, DV survivors and DV housing money all exist within one system that's part of the larger system for coordinated entry, which is great. There are other options though, and if you want to discuss those other options, I absolutely can help you with that. And we can make a plan to talk to your continuum. For those of you that are funded with DV Rapid Rehousing, all potential participants that you would enroll into your program must come from the community queue and be eligible for services under Category 4. Eligible for the program, under Category 4. Your continuums also all have different ways of communicating with programs regarding coordinated entry. Some of those are through a partnership agreement. There has been some miscommunication from PCADV in the past prior to PCADV starting a permanent housing project. Here, we want to make sure at PCADV that you all know that you are encouraged to sign participant agreements with your local coordinated entry entity. This allows for increased communication and for you to assure the survivor information is being handled as confidentially as possible within the system. It will give you insight to, if it's not, what needs to be done. And if you need, again, help problem solving that, please reach out to me. We really want to encourage you that the solution to the problems with coordinated entry is not ignoring it. It's in fact engaging with it and doing what DV advocates do best, which is bother everyone until a solution is made. We are happy to support you with that. It is the best advocacy tool that we have, and the more we're involved, the more a system can change to be friendly to survivors. So once a survivor is pulled from the community queue, and that happens differently in each continuum, you will need to work to get a survivor document ready to sign a lease. That is a common term within the housing community, is someone being document ready, and it's something that survivors in particular really struggle with, because we know oftentimes survivors don't have access to their personal information or have to leave a situation very quickly and don't have the things that they need to be able to sign a lease. So those things include a social security card, state ID or driver's license, a birth certificate, and you need the original birth certificate. So that's something that you can use flexible funds to help a survivor obtain. And then also financial documents, and that's proof of income, and that income can be from any source, and bank statements if a survivor does have a bank account. These are just, some of them are required, some of them are samples of things that are helpful, but you want to make sure that you as an advocate are working to get that together for survivors. So Lori just asked a question regarding coordinated entry, so we can go back there. She says that the SPDAT seems, so the VI SPDAT is the, and I can never remember what it means or what it stands for, and I usually have people around me that can interrupt me and tell me what it stands for. So if anybody, Kayla, I'm looking at you, want to type in what the VI SPDAT stands for, that would be great. The Vulnerability Index is a tool that is used by coordinated entry systems almost nationally to have a standardized method that allows for a score to be a result of the, thank you, my friends from Transitions, Tara and Kayla just answered me. It's the Vulnerability Index Service Prioritization Decision Assistance Tool, or the VI SPDAT, which is no wonder like that I can't remember that. I really should, and I apologize, but it's just, it's like so ridiculous to me that I can't like retain it in my mind. So the Vulnerability Index Service Prioritization Decision Assistance Tool, or the VI SPDAT, is the most common tool used nationally to assess households to get a score, which then allows them to be eligible for a certain housing intervention. Most often that intervention, if they're scoring in the mid-range, is rapid rehousing. Okay, so to set that all up, Lori asked, SPDAT seems to only ask one question about fleeing. If a survivor has a low SPDAT score, a 0 to 3, but needs to leave an abusive household, would they even score high enough for us to get to us for rapid rehousing? So this is something that we are looking at as to why survivors are scoring as low as they are. The VI SPDAT actually asks more than one question about fleeing. I think that it's 3 questions. The concern that we're having is that those questions aren't being asked in a way that is allowing survivors to answer confidently and truthfully. One of the ways that this is being addressed is that domestic violence organizations are administering the VI SPDAT to survivors. There is some conflicting opinion about whether or not that's the best use of an advocate's time, and if that information should even be information that's shared with an advocate. But this is one of those confusing situations in which we are asked to participate in a system to get funding to do this work, and that it is a necessary evil at the moment. There are other solutions that we can talk about as a community if you all are interested, but that's where we are right now. What I think is going on is that survivors are not being asked the questions in a way that is allowing them to get the score that they need. So if a survivor, though, is scoring low, so that would be 0 to 3, which would not qualify a household for rapid rehousing based on their VI SPDAT score. There are a couple things that can be done. The VI SPDAT can be redone, which is what I would encourage, because I cannot imagine a family that, or a household that's fleeing domestic violence scoring a 0 to 3 and having that be accurate. And I'm not saying that that means that anyone has messed up. I think you all have heard, many of you have heard my soapbox speech about the VI SPDAT. It has never been tested on survivors. It was designed specifically for street homeless populations. It is hugely important that there are tools out there that exist for street homeless populations that are working to move people from the street into permanent housing. That is not often the case for survivors. Homelessness looks very different for survivors. So what we need to make sure that we're doing is really looking at the tool and advocating for changes. I am more than happy to advocate for those changes, and as a community, we can talk more about that. The rapid rehousing funds that domestic violence organizations have received are for domestic violence households specifically. So what that means is that you are, as a funded agency, required to take whomever is on your community queue who is identifying as a DV survivor. What I think will happen is that the folks that are on your community queue that are scoring in the mid-range that qualifies them for rapid rehousing will be taken off the queue, and you may be able to bring more people into your program. And that means that you can pull people that are scoring a 3 or below into your program if there are no DV survivors on your community queue that want to live in your area that are scoring in the range for rapid. I also believe that people need to be housed without question. And if you are working with a family that needs to be housed and their VI-SPDAT score is off and things are confusing, I want to encourage you to house that family. And I understand that I just told you that they must be pulled from the coordinated entry queue and all of these things. But the most important thing that we can do is use HUD funding to house survivors in ways that survivors are identifying they need. If that means working around a system until a system is designed well for survivors, then that's what we need to do. If you all want to have more individual conversations about that or more conversations within your continuum, I am happy to have those conversations. The most important thing that we can do is make sure that survivors are getting housed. So Zachary said the questions are also asked only once to a survivor at one individual time and instance. Yes, so this is the other thing with the VI-SPDAT, is it is a snapshot, it is a moment in time. When the questions are asked, and we know that oftentimes survivors will be more likely to answer questions truthfully after they actually know a person, because there's so much risk that survivors face all of the time in being truthful with what's going on for them. And so if a VI-SPDAT needs to be re-administered, I want to encourage you to do that. If your continuum is not excited about the idea of that being done for survivors, please let me know and I will call them. I am happy to support you all in any way in making sure that survivors are getting as accurate VI-SPDAT scores as possible. And when they're not, making sure they get housed anyway, because that's the essential piece of this. We talked about documents, moving on to inspections. And Tara and Kayla, since I know that you are on this webinar, I'm gonna ask for your help. So it's interesting because part of what is required of a rapid rehousing funded program are inspections. And inspections of the property are actually very, very easy to do. But what should be used for that inspection, what tools should be used for that inspection, is not necessarily consistent. And I say this because I spent some time with our monitor from the HUD Philadelphia office last week, and I got inconsistent information. So I'm going to tell you what I know, and then I would love for you all to tell me what you're using. And this is only for programs that are receiving rapid rehousing money. And it also is far easier than most folks think that it is. So one of the things that has to be done when a survivor has found a unit to rent is that advocate that's working with that survivor, the DV counselor that's working with that survivor, needs to go to the property with that survivor and the landlord and walk around the property and use a checklist that talks about whether or not the windows are intact and the oven is working and there's hot water and all of these things that we would just want to make sure is existing for a survivor no matter what kind of property they move into. So I've provided you links to a couple of things. First of all is the PowerPoint slides from HUD directly, and so it's very exciting, I can assure you, for the Homelessness Prevention and Rental Assistance HPRP inspections. I'm linking to this PowerPoint because it is very thorough in talking about inspections and what you need to do. The thing that is tricky about this is that HPRP is no longer a funded HUD program, but the inspection sheets, according to the monitor from the HUD Philadelphia office, are the most thorough. So I linked to the standardized inspection form for all of you if you receive HUD funding. Those of you that are already running rapid rehousing programs, if you can let us know what inspection form you use, that would be great. Lisa says that they're using a form called the Minimum Standards for Permanent Housing. Lisa, if you wouldn't mind sending that form to me, I would really love to see it. I think that the more consistent we can be about what inspection forms are actually required, the better. Because one of the things with rapid rehousing that's different than if you're renting a Section 8 property, one of the things that we all always wait on with Section 8 properties is for an inspection to be done. Your inspection of rapid rehousing properties is not that. You do not have to be a certified inspector. You just have to follow a form and check some boxes. That is all the sort of stuff that you would want to do, as I said, for any unit that you are supporting financially. There's also something called an environmental review that needs to be done. And I spoke to a couple of folks, and we are not sure where the environmental review needs to exist. It may be something that just needs to exist at PCDB or at whomever your pass-through funder is for rapid rehousing. And I will follow up with all of you on that and let you know what I find out. But it is part of an inspection, and it may not be something that you all need to worry about, but it is one of the HUD inspections that's done. Lisa, thank you for sending that out or sending that to me. She said that she received it from another HUD recipient, and that's what they use, so we figured it would be okay. It's so funny to me because I feel like this is just sort of I feel like inspections are like this game of telephone that no one quite knows where it needs to land. So I'm going to do some more research on this too, and I'll let you all know. But the thing that I can promise you is that lead-based paint inspection is one that needs to be done. Carol says that they use the HPRP inspection forms. So that's what the link that I'm going to send to you is. Honestly, it's what I would recommend, even though that's not the funded program. It doesn't require a certified inspector, that anybody can go and do the inspection and walk through the property with that check sheet. So the other inspection that needs to be done is a lead-based paint inspection. There is a training online that I will send you a link to. It is very easy. You can complete your lead-based paint certification in just a few moments, and you get a certificate at the end of it, which I encourage each of you to hang in your office. I'm just kidding. But you also can, the essential part of that is that it lives within both your program file for rapid rehousing and in your employee file. So you have been a trained lead inspector. The inspection form is triggered by households with children under the age of 6, or property that was leased property that was constructed prior to 1978. It is easy. Most landlords have that information ready because it's a federal requirement, and it's easy to do. So that is the least of your concerns with inspections, and you get a certificate. So Kayla is talking a little bit about what she looks for specifically when she's doing inspections, and so that's a good list. And she says that they use the Housing Authority's checklist. That is a more thorough inspection than the HPRP. It's the Housing Quality Standards is what that one is called, and it's for Section 8 property specifically. So I'm not sure, like I said, I'm not sure which is necessary. I would like you all to do the least amount of work you have to do to get this done. So I'm going to figure that out, and I'm going to let you know. But what we now know without question is that everyone across the state is doing something different, which is always so exciting for me. So we're going to try to get consistent on that and make sure you all have the information you need. I don't want inspections to take time out of all of the million other things y'all need to do, but they are an important part of making sure that your funding is set. They are a HUD requirement, and I want to make sure you all have the information you need. So if there are other forms that are being used, please let us know, and we can take all that into account. So the most exciting part is leasing the unit. So a survivor has found a unit, they are ready to move in, and the unit must meet fair market rent standards. One of the things that you need to document is that the unit is within fair market rent standards, and that's an important component of this. It also must meet rent reasonableness for the area. So there's a form that if you are a rapid rehousing funded program that you will have that shows how you compare properties. It is really easy to do that. All you have to do is look on Craigslist or some sort of rental website in general that shows the price of properties in that area to make sure that the property that the survivor is renting isn't more than properties that are surrounding it. I think that that's an easy thing to check off, but one that is necessary. So the unit also must pass housing quality standards, the HQS inspection. That's what we have been talking about. The sort of party line with HUD is that the HQS is the thing to use. What the representative from HUD Philadelphia office told me is that the HPRP inspection can be used, so we'll get back to that. You also need an executed lease. So that means a lease that has been signed by both the participant and the landlord for their file. You need a W-9 form from the landlord that allows you to cut checks to the landlord, and then the survivor gets to move in. Kyle just asked, with all the other organizations using other forms, does PCADV have a preference on the form that you use for consistency, like using the HPRP form? So I think what I'm going to tell you right now is if you are using something, go ahead and use it. If you are not, use HPRP, and we can go from there. As we know more all together, I will let you all know. Let's see, and then there was another question from Rita. I know that fair market rent guidelines should include payment for utilities, etc. How much should be allocated for electric, gas? That is completely based on how much that runs in your area. It's so different in each area that I would encourage you to look at that individually, and we can have individual conversations about that if that's helpful. Philadelphia's fair market rent standards are very high compared to what's affordable for most families. Absolutely. I keep referencing the HUD Philadelphia office because that's PCADV is represented by the HUD Philadelphia office. So we are talking about across most of the eastern side of the state, and you need to figure out rent reasonableness for your area. So rent reasonableness, though, is defined, though, by property comparison. Fair market rent standards are one thing, but rent reasonableness is looking at a property comparison. So those are different. And if you have more questions about that, we can have individual conversations. Rent assistance is paid on a monthly basis, and it's triggered by the survivor sharing proof of income. So part of what is required in a program is a survivor to give you some sort of monthly income statement. What we want to average is no one paying more than 30% of their income toward rent, but we also know that a million things can come up with survivors to make things difficult for them. So rental assistance should be recalculated on a monthly basis and based on current income. But if a survivor is dealing with significant financial challenges or emotional challenges or a variety of other things, you want to really tailor this program to their needs. And if that means for a period of months, making sure that their rent is covered because they are dealing with their kiddos being in therapy and they are dealing with a family crisis that doesn't even have anything to do with the domestic violence that's occurred, make sure that you as an organization are flexible enough to be there for them financially in the ways that a survivor really needs. But having that monthly conversation with a survivor about, this is your income, this would be 30% of your income that you would want to calculate toward rent. Does that work? Does that not work? What is it that you need? Have that conversation on a monthly basis. Then you also want to retain proof of income on a monthly basis for the survivor's file. Just while we're talking about files, it's important to remember that all of this exists outside of ETO. There are specific things that you'll want to put into ETO. And if you are a funded rapid rehousing program, that ETO component will be turned on for you. But as far as any sort of personally identifying information, you want to keep that outside of ETO, and then when you do have an audit for your program, you'll want to redact the files as you would. And then there was also, someone shared how they calculate utility allowances. So if you have that information to share with people, please do. So as I said prior, rapid rehousing standards for each of your continuums are going to be different, but it's important to remember the rental assistance can be provided up to 24 months, but 12 is the ideal. So you want to plan someone's program out for 12 months, know that you can be flexible, and know that you need to work to make sure that you're following the survivor's needs, with also knowing that there is only so much financial assistance you can give. So if it is looking like a survivor is coming, about midway through their rapid rehousing, about 6 months, 6 months into the rapid rehousing program, and it does not look like they are going to be able to ever be in a place where they can pay their full rent, because I think that we can often be very hopeful when someone is moving into rapid rehousing. Then what I would encourage you to do is either look at the survivor's ability to move into a more affordable apartment, or the survivor's eligibility for a Section 8 voucher. Rapid rehousing, if it doesn't work, it is not the end of the story. It is a great thing to try. It's a great thing to get somebody into permanent housing, and it doesn't work for everyone. There are a lot of folks that it does work for, but for the people that it doesn't, you want to make sure that you're providing other options and being really real about those options early into their program. And then the supportive services that go along as a component to rapid rehousing are determined by the needs of the survivor. There are no requirements around supportive services. Everything is completely voluntary. Our funding sources and best practices regarding survivors denote that. But what I do want you to know is that if you are not hearing from somebody, it means that something, you all know this, but it means something else is going on. And I would not encourage you to continue to pay someone's rent that you're not hearing from. What I would encourage you to do is make sure that at a minimum, the survivor knows that they need to get together with you once a month to provide proof of income so you can recalculate rent and have all of that done. But that also, the more frequently they meet with you, the more likely they are to retain their housing. And the more services you can provide, the more work can be done together. So really working to partner with the household to make sure that they're able to retain housing is really important, but also remember that you cannot have any sort of service requirements attached to any of your services, but specifically in this case, rapid rehousing. Just in conclusion, the best way to support survivors is through the ideas of safety, confidentiality, and being trauma informed. This is, the basics of the work that we do every day. And just because we're providing permanent housing doesn't mean that this is any different. We want to make sure that people can continue to support themselves and get the things they need from domestic violence services while looking for an apartment and looking to rent and being able to maintain that housing. It's very important. So we have a little bit of time left. If there are any specific questions that haven't been asked as we've been going, I'm happy to take those now. So we're going to be offering a series of housing webinars upcoming. I know that many of you had registered for the prevention and diversion webinar that was supposed to be later this week. Unfortunately, there are some systems outside of the DV community that need to be addressed prior to us talking about prevention and diversion, but that will be a very exciting webinar and a very exciting conversation to have, because I think that you all in the programs in Pennsylvania do so much homelessness prevention and shelter diversion already with your access to relocation funds that I think that thinking about other creative ways to do that will be really important. We'll also be doing a webinar on landlord engagement, and I'll be pulling in some of our partners throughout the state to talk about work that they're doing. So be on the lookout for that, and we'll be sure to send those out as they are scheduled. Both of the lease and the utilities should all be in the household's name. So the head of household should be the person whose name is on the lease and whose utilities are named under. Part of the component of rapid rehousing is that the lease and utilities are in the household's name. There's lots of great conversation happening about utilities. I feel like I did not give enough information about that within the training. So I apologize for that, but I appreciate the information that's being shared now. So it is the responsibility of the tenant to pay utilities and to pay their rent. The support for the unit is based on what the survivor is asking for. It is never the responsibility of the program to make sure rent is paid or to make sure utilities are paid. That's why it's essential for the survivor to be meeting with you once a month to talk about what their bills are, to talk about what their income is. Utilities across the board are not paid for within Rapid Rehousing. Some programs pay for them, some don't. So it depends on how you wrote your grant. For those of you that are PCDV funded, you'll be getting a copy of your contract in the next week, I hope, that will outline what your budget is for utilities. And so you'll want to divide that in the best way possible. Amy had a question about, I missed something in the conversation about fleeing domestic violence and when a survivor would not need to be literally homeless or in a DV shelter to qualify for rapid rehousing. So for rapid rehousing funding, a survivor does not need to be literally homeless or in a shelter to qualify for rapid rehousing. They have to be eligible for rapid rehousing under category 4, which is fleeing domestic violence. So this is for all of the HUD funded COC rapid rehousing. If you are a program that has emergency services grant or ESG rapid rehousing, then they do have to be both literally homeless, so in a shelter, and fleeing domestic violence. But the majority of you have rapid rehousing or have access to rapid rehousing that is HUD funded through the COC, and they do not have to be literally homeless to receive those funds. Are there any other questions at this point? Thank you all so much for attending and thank you for your time today. This is my contact information, so if you need me, this is my email and it is my phone number, and you're welcome to call or email me anytime and I'll get back to you with specific answers to questions. There was another piece of information that was shared that families on a fixed income are having a hard time maintaining the unit. VA-SPDAT does not ask questions about number of judgments, utility arrears, or fixed income. All of these things are very important in estimating families' retention in a unit. Why are these things not discussed? That is a really great question that I do not have the answer to. I think that this is an important piece that if a family is referred to you for rapid rehousing, in our links, we can also send out a housing assessment that we would recommend using for all of the families that are coming into your rapid rehousing programs. It does ask all of these questions about number of evictions, utility arrears, etc., what your income is. What I would then encourage you to do is, after asking them those questions before you enroll them in your rapid rehousing program, to go back to the folks that are running your coordinated entry system and say, this person was referred and here are all the concerns, because you certainly don't want to bring someone into a program that they're not going to be successful in. So I really understand that. And I think that, I'm not sure where the person that asked this question is located, but I think in tighter rental markets, it is very common that people are brought into rapid rehousing that maybe are not going to be as successful as others. We want to make sure that doesn't happen. There have to be more solutions for survivors within the system. So as you're getting referrals that are potentially not the best fit for the program because of things that they have experienced in the past, and this particularly for people on a fixed income, I think this is a huge component. Giving that feedback into your coordinated entry system about referrals is really essential. And then Kayla pointed out that VA-SPDAT is simply an assessment tool that determines prioritization, is not to be used as a case management tool. Kayla, thank you for saying that. This is another significant issue of mine. If you are a domestic violence program that is administering the VA-SPDAT, I want to encourage you to look at it as though it is in a bubble. It is not information that we would typically ask survivors, nor is it information that many of us as DV advocates should even be privy to. But given the nature of coordinated entry and the way that VA-SPDATs are often administered, we want to make sure that they're as trauma-informed and survivor-centered as possible. So to do that, many domestic violence organizations are administering the VASPDAT. If you're doing that, it does not go into anyone's record. It should not be kept by the domestic violence agency. It should be done on paper. The scores should be sent then into the coordinated entry system through whatever means or your continuum of care does that. And then that information is not used as a case management tool. In mainstream homelessness, it often is. That is their decision, and that is lovely for them. And that is absolutely not what we're going to do, because that's not congruent with domestic violence services. So it's great if you can do this. It's really, really helpful to survivors, but it has to exist outside of what you would information you would typically keep. So if you have more questions about that, please reach out to me. If you are wanting to learn how to administer the tool and you are a program within the Eastern continuum of care in Pennsylvania, you can contact Kayla Gower, who has been messaging us on the webinar. So thank you all so much for being in attendance today. I really, really appreciate it. And as I said, please fill out the evaluation form and let me know what further information you need. I'm always happy to talk and problem solve with all of you. And I'm excited to see how we continue to administer and get survivors into permanent housing here in Pennsylvania. Thanks so much.